A jellyfish, a gigolo, a politic, don't make a lick of diff, no. Nobody escapes. A puppy dog, a butterfly, ladies and babies, you're first in line. Nobody escapes. Amen. And they won't go easy on you just 'cause you're skinny. And they won't go easy on me just 'cause I'm pretty. Yeah, pretty ugly. The innocent, the animals, everyone here, get down in the hole. Nobody escapes. Amen, yeah. And they won't go easy on you just 'cause you're so skinny. And they won't go easy on me just 'cause I'm so pretty. Just 'cause I'm so pretty. So pretty, pretty ugly. So follow me into the sky and let the sun burn you alive. Nobody escaped. Nobody escaped. Nobody escaped.
The Australian government has once again embraced its Mad Max roots this month, as it unveiled a plan which would ban any social media platform for citizens under the age of 16. The proposed law is stated to improve online safety for Australian youth, and is intended to combat mental health issues, online bullying, and misinformation. As you might imagine, the proposed ban seems to have been created with very little input from tech experts, which has always been the case when the Australian government goes about drafting tech policy. The first problem is that the proposed laws, at least as they're currently presented, would force social media sites to take and store government identifiers. As experts have pointed out, private companies tend to have a pretty bad track record of storing private information securely. In fact, in 2022, major Australian telecom company Optus suffered a data breach which led to a third of the entire country having their private information stolen. Another problem is that the definition of a social media platform is incredibly broad according to the proposal, and would include sites like YouTube, Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, Fortnite, Roblox, and arguably even Steam. The Australian Child Rights Task Force, an advocacy group for child rights within the country, has called the proposed law, quote, too blunt an instrument. They argue that instead of trying to ban these platforms outright, the government should instead aim to provide young people with the opportunity to benefit from these online spaces, while crafting safety standards to protect vulnerable people. All things considered, this is probably the right call. If you speak to an average Zoomer, social media is how they talk to their friends, how they find like-minded people, and where they get the majority of their news. That last point is obviously still a problem, but in the modern day, social media has almost become critical communications infrastructure. I mean, this entire news team runs out of a Discord server. Some skeptics have argued that banning social media until the age of 16 simply kicks the can down the road, and others have even made the case that delaying online exposure leaves young people more vulnerable to malicious interactions. Anyone who has ever scammed in old-school RuneScape will know that they never listen to a stranger offering to trim their armor again. As previously mentioned, Australian lawmakers have a long history of not understanding how technology works. In 2018, the government passed the Assistance and Access Bill, which would enforce communication providers to allow the government to intercept encrypted information. This is despite experts warning them that installing vulnerabilities for encrypted communication defeats the entire purpose of it ever being encrypted. The bill is also known as the Arse Access Bill. Other greatest hits include the government paying significantly more money for woefully outdated internet infrastructure, and a proposed bill that would have taxed electric cars per kilometre driven. As part of our research this month, we spoke to an Australian teacher who teaches the 12 to 13 age group that these laws would most likely affect. To our surprise, the proposed laws have already been a topic of discussion in her class. Despite being relatively young, her students have questioned how exactly the government plans to enforce such a ban. which, as we mentioned, is a detail that Australian lawmakers have yet to answer. We also asked whether the curriculum covers online literacy, with things like teaching students how to avoid scams, identify misinformation, or deal with cyberbullying. According to her, whether these topics are taught are at the discretion of individual teachers. This naturally means that some students will be more equipped than their peers to identify and manage these common pitfalls. So far, the heads of all 8 Australian states and territories have unanimously backed the ban. Should the legislation be passed, social media sites will have 1 year to implement age verification before the law comes into effect. Viewers who are looking to very easily get around such restrictions will likely be interested in today's sponsor. If you're trying to stay anonymous while browsing the web, looking to watch region-locked content, or trying to keep a clone army secret while slowly infiltrating the Galactic Senate, then you might be in need of a VPN. Lucky for you, Surfshark VPN is the greatest VPN in the galaxy. Now, we all know that Surfshark VPN will keep you safe from malware, trackers, phishing attempts, and buzz droids. However, it's also amazing for watching content not always available in your country. We've all likely come across a message like this when we've clicked on a YouTube link, and then when we try to find out why the archives are incomplete, we're just gaslit into thinking it doesn't exist. But with Surfshark, simply change your location to anywhere in the world and watch whatever you want free of those pesky content restrictions. Naboo didn't get locked down in its perfectly legal trade blockade, and now neither will you. It's a great time to sign up to Surfshark, because by going to surfshark.com/surswag or scanning the holocron on screen, you'll be able to score yourself an extra 4 months for free. What's even better is that if you start using Surfshark and find it's not meeting your expectations, you can cancel within the first 30 days and get a full refund. No questions asked. If only the Galactic Republic could cancel the mysteriously ordered clone army that easily. Surfshark VPN. Now this is pod racing. Meanwhile, Alex Jones's InfoWars is bought out by a satirical news website. A former Disney star beats up one of the greatest heavyweight boxers of all time. And the Waltz Harris campaign launches its own Fortnite map. We now get to the story you've all been waiting for, the 2024 US presidential election. The consequences of US elections tend to have enormous ripple effects not only for America, but the entire world. So not only are we going to be covering the election itself, but we're also going to cover what the American people just voted for. Buckle up, because this is a big one. As you probably know by now, Republican candidate Donald Trump won the election quite convincingly against his Democratic opponent Kamala Harris. The figures as of time of writing came down to 76.6 million votes and 312 electoral points for President Trump, while Harris received 74.1 million votes and 226 electoral points. Although the popular vote sounds pretty close, Trump managed to nab every single battleground state in the country, which is a pretty definitive rejection of Kamala Harris's presidential ambitions. In addition, the Republican Party won a majority in the House of Representatives, which will give them full control over the House, Senate, and presidency, at least until the midterm elections in 2026. This is a pretty big deal, because when all three are controlled by a single party, this is known as a unified government. This is because members of the same party are more likely to vote in line with one another, meaning unlike President Trump's previous term, it will be much easier for him to push through reform. As long as the Republican Party are all pulling in the same direction, Democrats might as well be cosmetic. If we're still sticking with our Star Wars references, in terms of the Senate, Trump is the Senate. Another boon in favor of President Trump is the Supreme Court, as the court has seen a conservative majority since his last time in office. If this still isn't enough, the Trump administration looks far more prepared compared to its last time taking office, meaning the former and now future president is expected to be far more effective in his lawmaking efforts. Unified governments have come along dozens of times in American history, however not in the lifetimes of our younger viewers. The most recent unified government was from 2003 to 7, during George W. Bush's administration. As viewers have probably seen, democratically aligned media outlets have been theorizing the reason for such a dominant Republican sweep on election night. Most people tend to have their own theories and speculation, but we're going to do our best to stick to the hard data. The first major difference for this election was the overall turnout. Despite COVID-19 having the world by the balls, turnout in the 2020 cycle set records in several states across the country. In total, about 66% of eligible voting-aged Americans voted in 2020, the highest rate of participation in any election since 1900. By contrast, the voter participation in this election was only about 63%. This may not seem like much, but in a nation as large as the United States, that represents roughly 7.2 million people. We should keep in mind, however, that those 7.2 million people technically joined the majority because citizens who didn't vote once again made up the largest bloc in the country. For as much as we talk about how divided America has become, it seems most people really don't give a shit about politics. That, or the lack of ranked choice voting, has forced a two-party system which has entirely disengaged the majority of the nation and polarized the rest. But who's to say? With this in mind, Republican support seemed to rise marginally among pretty much all demographics. However, both Asian and Hispanic voter blocs saw huge swings for Trump, shifting 7% and 13% respectively. These groups aren't exactly monolithic, so the reason for this shift isn't something we can talk about with any confidence. A big advantage of such a sweep in the polls is that the American people knew the results really quickly, which was a welcome change from 2020's drawn-out race. This is because races are called when news outlets can mathematically predict that one candidate no longer has a single path to victory. Think of Doctor Strange looking into 14 million different futures, but instead of a levitating wizard, it's just a bunch of tired data nerds working at the Associated Press. At this point, viewers might be asking, what did the American people actually vote for? As is the nature of US politics, we expect that some of these policies are going to make Trump's America sound like a utopia to some, and a nonsensical hellscape to others. But for just a minute, let's put aside our differences, and all take this Rorschach test together. To start with the economy, we decided to enlist the help of economist Jasper Ahmed, who works at the Australian Treasury and writes briefings for the National Treasurer. Before we dive in, however, we should probably keep in mind that President Trump has been known for his brand of strategic unpredictability, literally living by the mantra of never let your enemies know your next move. The downside of this approach is that economists have to work overtime to model a lot of different scenarios depending on what President Trump actually plans to do. Trump's two major policies which will have a large impact on the economy are 1. A 60% tariff on China and an additional 10% tariff on the rest of the world, and 2. The mass deportation of illegal immigrants. This means that just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we're going to be working with 3 different timelines to make everything easier to follow. The first timeline is the baseline economy. In this scenario, Trump ditches his tariff and deportation plan, puts up his feet, and just lets things run as they are. In this scenario, we can expect inflation to largely normalize, with the IMF forecasting that prices will inflate by 3% from 2024 to 25, and GDP growth will continue at a stable rate of 2 to 3% per year for the next decade. This will be our baseline to which we compare the other two scenarios. The second timeline is if President Trump goes through with his aforementioned tariff plan. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imports from a particular country. So if a company in the US wants to purchase Chinese goods to sell domestically, these goods face a tariff upon entering the US. Tariffs are designed to make domestically produced goods more competitive with cheaper imports, which is intended to make US manufacturing more viable for the US market. It doesn't actually make domestic goods cheaper, but it'll make imported goods more expensive. Some economists have criticized Trump's flat 10% tariff on all imported goods, as although the US is an economic powerhouse, there are some things that can't be made domestically. You can't exactly grow coffee on mainland USA, and an overwhelming number of electronics are imported from Asia. We're yet to see whether the Trump administration carves out exceptions for such goods. Although a 10% tariff on all imports is very significant in its own right, a 60% tariff on China is like unleashing fucking Exodia on the Chinese economy. Chinese GDP is expected to fall by a peak of 1 whole percentage point from baseline by mid-2026, and this has huge knock-on effects for the rest of the world. Oxford Economics predicts a minor to highly significant fall in global GDP depending on the severity of these tariffs. Nations that are reliant on trade should be particularly worried, especially if they've never lost a war to emus. For the US, however, the 60% tariff means an estimated $618 billion loss to real GDP by 2040, falling by a peak peak of 0.2 percentage points from our baseline scenario in 2027. On top of this, US inflation is expected to grow by a peak of 0.4 additional percentage points in 2025. However, this becomes significantly worse if China were to retaliate. In this case, inflation would now peak at 0.7 percentage points higher than baseline in 2025, continuing to be higher than normal until 2027. We now get onto our third timeline, one where Trump fulfills his promise of conducting, quote, the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. Currently, there are approximately 8.3 million unauthorized immigrants in the American workforce. However, it is unfeasible logistically that all 8.3 million are deported. Fortunately, we can look at history as a guide, as America's 1956 Operation Wetback pretty much did the exact same thing. In this operation, the US government deported 1.3 million migrants. So for simplistic sake, we'll run with that number as the minimum impact of Trump's plan. We should, however, keep in mind that the US government is significantly more equipped to conduct a mass deportation in the modern day. So this 1.3 million figure is very conservative. In the scenario that 1.3 million migrants are deported, US labor supply is expected to be 0.9% lower than baseline in 2028. Over this same period, GDP will also be expected to fall by around 1.2% relative to baseline in 2028. The lower labor supply also has significant implications for the US job market, leading to significant unemployment in manufacturing, mining, and agriculture. US manufacturing in particular would be expected to lose up to 3% of hours worked by 2028. This is because manufacturing in the US is largely comprised of complex, end-of-line manufacturing, like assembling cars, agricultural machinery, or spaceships. As the return on investment for manufacturers would be lower, since labor would cost more, manufacturers would have to employ less workers and produce less of their goods to offset costs. Some manufacturers may even move overseas to take advantage of cheaper labor, resulting in even less jobs in the US. The same effect will be observed across mining and agriculture, although to a lesser extent. Inflation is also expected to increase significantly, with the deportation policy causing an additional 0.5 percentage points of inflation from baseline in 2026. Put simply, this is due to the increased cost of labor stemming from a shrinking workforce, decreasing supply, and thus driving up prices. We should keep in mind that figures used for both the tariff and immigration policies are calculated independently in a vacuum. This means that in the most likely scenario where President Trump enacts both his immigration and tariff policy, their effects will likely compound on one another. While other countries are expected to be affected drastically by these policies, it's really hard to project these outcomes, especially when both the US and China are so incredibly intertwined with the rest of the globe. As you probably already know, the field of economics is really fucking hard, which is why we hired an economist to do all this research in the first place. Even still, there's a saying that no one can predict the future, least of all economists. So even with a myriad of figures and graphs, viewers should still take this whole analysis with a grain of salt. Of course, the good news is that Trump's administration plans to drop the tax rate across the board, meaning income taxes for everyone are about to go down. Viewers who earn a shit ton of money or own a US business will be particularly pleased, as the top 5% of earners will see the greatest benefit under Trump's proposed tax brackets. In an alternate timeline where Kamala Harris won the presidency, the bottom 75% would have been taxed slightly less than Trump's plan. However, the top earners would have been taxed significantly more. The good news is that compared to Biden, taxes for most people would have been lower no matter who won the White House. But let's move away from the economy and look at a few other areas of Trump's policy. President Trump has already started filling important positions ahead of his inauguration in January, and this lets us peek further into what Trump's Season 2 might look like. It's worth noting that a consistent problem for President Trump during his last presidency was that a lot of his appointments tended to clash with his own vision for the country. This is likely why his latest appointments have all been hardline Trump loyalists, and for lack of a better term, tend to have a lot of character. His appointments are like the part of a Jason Statham movie where he's getting the crew back together for one more heist, and everyone has their own wacky gimmick. To head the Department of Health, Mr. Trump has appointed RFK Jr., seen here absolutely jacked out of his mind. RFK Jr. himself has a long history of health advocacy, and holds the view that food and pharmaceutical industries have too much sway over American health policy. He's also taken aim at health standards for both school lunches and ultra-processed foods, stating that many Americans' diets are leading to a wide array of health problems and diseases. RFK RFK himself is an incredibly well-meaning appointment for this position. However, the scientific community is less enthusiastic about his leadership. RFK Jr. has a long documented history of being a conspiracy theorist, and not just a casual conspiracy theorist. This guy is a ranked, competitive conspiracy theorist, like has published entire books level of conspiracy theorist. He's previously stated that vaccines cause autism, advocated for the removal of fluoride in public drinking water, and promoted the use of ivermectin to combat COVID-19. And only last year stated, quote, "COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are the Ashkenazi Jews and the Chinese." We obviously don't have time to explain why every single one of those things were wrong, but such views have made a lot of health experts particularly nervous. Mr. Trump's campaign leading up to the election was pretty light on health information, and his entire GOP platform from his campaign website only has 2 sentences dedicated to healthcare. It promises to expand choice and transparency for prescription drugs, expand access to affordable healthcare, and protect Medicare. In Mr. Trump's first term, he unsuccessfully attempted to repeal the Affordable Care Act on multiple occasions. However, with his current unified government, he might be more successful in his second term. Moving on to the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and Mr. Trump has appointed Lee Zeldin, seen here only inches away from getting fucking stabbed. Mr. Zeldin himself doesn't have an amazing track record when it comes to the environment, previously expressing doubts on the effects of climate change, being a vocal critic of the Paris Climate Agreement, and formally pledging to reverse New York's ban on hydraulic fracking. President Trump has had a fairly dismissive view of climate-related concerns, and during his first term implemented his America First energy plan. Mr. Trump's environmental policies have usually revolved around putting aside climate concerns in favor of attaining energy independence. Anyone who works for the American oil and gas industry is in for a good 4 years. Over his first term, Trump rolled back over 100 environmental regulations, and has promised to roll back many more in his proposed second term. President Trump is expected to once again pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, allowing drilling in nearly all US waters, and relax emission standards for new vehicles. According to an analysis by Carbon Brief, the previous policies of neither Trump nor Biden would put the US on track to become net zero by 2050. With this in mind, according to the US government's own calculations of the social cost of carbon, the expenses related to enacting climate policies could still be much lower than the cost of climate inaction. The social cost of carbon is an EPA metric, which is simply the expected societal cost through things like crop shortages, extreme weather events, and health-related problems as a result of man-made climate change. Using these estimates, if Trump did decide to roll back Biden's environmental policies, the added social cost could be as much as $900 billion by the end of this decade. When we previously spoke to climate scientist Kyle Buffington from Oregon State University, he would comment on President Trump's climate policies, quote, "Neither Trump nor Biden's policies will get the country to net zero emissions by 2050. The Biden administration would certainly help to mitigate some of the runaway emissions we've been experiencing over the past few decades, but in all likelihood, the US will continue to struggle to make a full green transition. On the other hand, a Trump administration could mean the development of policies and deals that have irrevocable consequences on the nation's carbon footprint. None of this bodes well for the future of the planet's climate." End quote. Moving into the classroom, and Mr. Trump has filled the position of Education Secretary with Linda McMahon, seen here getting knocked out by Kane on a WWE stage. Linda is quite famously the co-founder of WWE, alongside her husband Vince McMahon, seen here getting tackled to the ground by President Trump. This really is the golden age of news reporting. Aren't you glad you didn't get your election news from the BBC? Although she doesn't have a teaching background, Linda McMahon served on the Connecticut State Board of Education for a year in 2009. And in 2012, made a $5 million donation to the Sacred Heart University. Trump seems to have a more specific vision when it comes to education in his proposed second term. His plan calls for a certification program for teachers who embrace patriotic values, and has proposed abolishing teacher tenure, a policy which prevents teachers from being fired for any non-work related reason. Trump is also pushing for the reduction of administration roles within education, as well as adopting a parental bill of rights. Trump's plan for a second term also includes cutting federal funding for any schools that teach, quote, critical race theory, gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content onto our children. President Trump has also stated that he would close the Department of Education, leaving education matters to be decided by states at an individual level. Trump hasn't talked about this point all that much, so we'll have to see if anything comes of it. More interesting appointments were for the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE for short. This department will be headed jointly by both presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, seen here rapping at the Iowa State Fair, and tech billionaire Elon Musk, seen here dressed as Wario. It should be noted that DOGE will not fund function as a usual federal department, as its formation would require the approval of Congress. Instead, it will act in an advisory role, and although it wouldn't actually have any regulatory power, it will be able to make suggestions to Trump's unified government directly. The entire concept of Doge came from a discussion between Trump and Musk, with Musk being one of Trump's biggest supporters during his campaign. Musk quite famously has a history of enacting cost-cutting measures. After his purchase of Twitter in 2022, he would immediately cut the workforce from around 8,000 to nearly 1,000. Mr. Musk previously called for the US budget to be cut by $2 trillion, which would slash government spending by a third. On the other hand, when Vivek Ramaswamy was running for president, he promised to fire more than 75% of federal workers, and promised to close down several government agencies, including the Department of Education and the FBI. Once again, we have no idea whether any of this will actually happen, and if it does, we'll be out of our pay grade to predict what this could actually mean for the American people. Either way, we're in for an interesting 4 years. In the interest of time, we're not going to delve into every single government department, but for viewers who want a better idea of what a Trump second term might look like, we previously made an entire video dedicated to comparing Trump and Kamala's policies, which we'll leave linked down below. Foreign policy was also a huge topic, so we'll be touching on those in our other stories when relevant. As always, a link to all sources used will be down in the description. We now return to the place that God forgot about, the Middle East. The war between Israel and Hamas still rages within the confines of Gaza, and unfortunately there isn't much on the ground that doesn't sound like we just copy-pasted a script from any time over the last year. On the 2nd of this month, UNICEF reported that over 50 children were killed in airstrikes within the city of Jabalia over just 2 days. 2 days later, another airstrike in Beit Lahia would go on to kill at least 20 people, an incident which shouldn't be confused with another airstrike that hit the same area the week before, killing 93 people. This was just the first few days of the month, but sadly, if we actually mentioned every individual airstrike, we probably wouldn't have time for anything else. In even worse news, aid within Gaza has dropped to an 11-month low. Over the previous month of October, 57 aid trucks were allowed to cross into Gaza per day, a figure which was much lower than the 350 demanded by the US and the 600 which was recommended by aid agencies. Getting aid into civilian hands has become especially dangerous, time-consuming, and fraught with red tape. And according to aid agencies, Israeli authorities either denied or impeded 58% of all aid movements. On top of this, UN officials state that a third of all aid brought into Gaza is either stolen by criminals to be resold far above market value or taken by Hamas. Although the International Court of Justice is still examining whether Israel's assault into Gaza constitutes a genocide, there are certainly a lot of signs pointing in that direction. According to a report published by a UN Special Committee this month, Israel's conduct within Gaza is consistent with the characteristics of genocide. The report states, quote, "Since the beginning of the war, Israeli officials have publicly supported policies that strip Palestinians of the very necessities required to sustain life: food, water, and fuel. These statements, along with the systematic and unlawful interference of humanitarian aid, make clear Israel's intent to instrumentalize life-saving supplies for political and military gains." End quote. The United States, Israel's closest ally, has repeatedly stated that it would cut off military aid if humanitarian conditions within Gaza don't improve. In fact, US law dictates that weapons shipments are to be cut off to any nation who block the delivery of US aid. However, these threats have consistently proven toothless, as Israel has regularly not met the demands of the United States. Speaking of the United States, as we previously mentioned, the nation is set to once again welcome former and future President Donald Trump back into office, who of course will play a significant role in shaping Middle Eastern foreign policy. Mr. Trump's specific policies aren't entirely clear. However, his previous time in office saw US-Israel relations especially strengthened. His previous term moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem, recognized the occupied Golan Heights as Israeli territory, and in 2019, the Trump administration declared that Israeli settlements were not illegal under international law. Trump's nominee for ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, also seems to share similar sentiments, having a long history of voicing support for the expansion of Israeli territory. President-elect Trump also appointed Steve Witkoff to serve as his special envoy envoy to the Middle East. And earlier this year, Witkoff commented on Trump's previous time in office with, quote, "With President Trump, the Middle East experienced historic levels of peace and stability. Strength prevents wars. Iran's money was cut off, which prevented their funding of global terror." End quote. We couldn't find any history of Witkoff's experience as a diplomat, as he's a real estate investor by trade. However, he does seem to have quite the close relationship with President Trump. So close, in fact, that he was present during his attempted golf course assassination earlier in September. In the first presidential debate back in June, Trump stated that the United States should, quote, "let them, Israel, go and let them finish the job." Whether the relationship between the US and Israel will change between now and when Mr. Trump once again assumes power remains to be seen. However, viewers probably shouldn't expect any drastic measures in the twilight hours of Biden's administration. At this point, we should probably remember that Israel is also at war with Hezbollah, a faction which acts as a de facto government within many parts of neighboring Lebanon. The Israel-Lebanon conflict tends to generate pretty similar headlines to the ones we mentioned within Gaza, with tens of thousands being killed every few days via rocket attacks. However, in this case, Hezbollah has proven to be much more formidable in its retaliation efforts. Instead of listing these specific incidents which can admittedly leave people pretty desensitized, we wanted to take a snapshot of this conflict from the perspective of people within the country. We were lucky enough to speak to a student from northern Lebanon, a person we'll just call Jim. On the other hand, we once again talked to IDF tanker Sergeant Daniel, who's been on the ground within Lebanon since the start of Israel's incursion. To start with our student, Jim told us that he was from the northern city of Batroun, a place which he told us had been spared from much of the war. Despite this, he mentioned that the city itself has become overwhelmed with refugees fleeing from the south, meaning a lot of public schools have been repurposed to house the influx of people. Jim also mentioned that Lebanon's economy has been suffering even more than usual, as this most recent conflict comes after 3 years of financial meltdown within the country. A World Bank report released in the middle of this month estimated that the war had already come to an economic cost of $8.5 billion US, and that 875,000 people have been internally displaced within the country. We wanted to know if Jim had any questions to ask Sergeant Daniel directly, to which he had two. His first question was, "How do you feel about the number of civilian deaths? I know very well that they, Hezbollah, use people like meat shields, but is the amount of civilians versus combatants worth it?" When we passed this on to Sergeant Daniel, he would first preface his answer to say that it was his personal opinion, and not representative of the Israeli Defense Force or the wider Israeli government. In a fairly long response, he would reply, quote, "I'll keep it simple. It's horrible. It always is. In war, ultimately, the people who suffer the most on both sides are the civilians. In a war, it's hard to think about the other side, especially when yourself have been hurt somehow, but I always try to keep it in mind. And yes, like he, Jim, said, the enemies we're fighting are doing their all to make this as difficult as they can for us, using human shields, hiding weapons and ammo stockpiles in hospitals and schools, and preventing evacuations. Now, is it worth it? I can't tell you. I will never have an answer to that. I don't think anyone at this time will. History will say if it was worth it, but we do what must be done. Our entry into Lebanon revealed enormous stockpiles of weapons, command posts, ambush sites, and many other instruments of war, all presumably prepared to launch an invasion into North Israel, similar to the 7 October attack and massacre by Hamas, but probably much bigger and worse. So we could leave Lebanon alone and let Hezbollah do its thing, and then we'd pay an incalculable price, but we can't, because that's what you must do. You have to first and foremost protect your people and country, and unfortunately when you do that, people get hurt. But we still try all we can to minimize civilian casualties. Leaflets, personal calls, hacking broadcasts to urge people to evacuate from places and buildings that are going to get struck. We truly do our best, but obviously sometimes your best isn't enough. Our current mission objective in Lebanon is to make it so that the civilians of Israel can never again be threatened by Hezbollah. And we'll do what's necessary to achieve that, because we owe it to them." End quote. We also wanted to ask about Israel's targeting of civilian infrastructure, and whether all the buildings hit are genuinely valid military targets. Sergeant Daniel would once again reply, quote, "My answer is quite similar. It's terrible that civilian infrastructure is targeted, but again, unfortunately, Hezbollah isn't giving us any choice. Like I said before, they purposely put their rockets, weapons, and ammo under civilian infrastructure. We can't just ignore it. It's so horrible, and it looks and sounds horrible, but we must. But again, we do our best to minimize civilian harm. I don't know regarding the cities in the north or the validity of targets. Again, I'm not involved in it in any way. My answer will be obvious, but from what I know, we only strike valid targets. We don't decimate buildings for fun. We strike places which intel led us to believe contain either terrorists, weapons, or both. And I personally hope that this happens only after we did all we could to get the uninvolved out. So in short, I believe and hope all targets struck are valid targets. This is all I can really say from my perspective. But again, even though I'm a soldier operating in Lebanon right now, I'm pretty much not involved at all in what he, Jim, is really asking about. So this all might as well be from a civilian. End quote. Jim goes on to describe why he thinks Israel would likely exacerbate further violence within the region. As he explains, although Hezbollah isn't the Lebanese government, it basically functions like a government within much of southern Lebanon. For many civilians, Hezbollah provides food, shelter, money, education, and welfare. So from their perspective, Israel isn't just weeding out a terrorist organization, they're crossing the border to attack their own government. Jim explains that this isn't just a fringe view within Lebanon either, as many Lebanese politicians echo this sentiment. Despite this, Jim tells us that there appears to be quite a divide within the nation, with support for Hezbollah being far more entrenched in the south, while the citizens in the north are likely to be more critical of the group. Jim believes that the reason Hezbollah was able to become so powerful in the first place is due to the rampant corruption within Lebanon. As he explains, quote, "The rise of Hezbollah was not just in one night. Hezbollah is a military, resistant force. Their entry into politics is not acceptable. So how did they allow for such people to join? Every major political party abandoned their weapon, but not Hezbollah. Yet they still recognize Hezbollah. They still let Hezbollah participate in politics, distribute weapons, and build bunkers. Do you think all of this happened without a lot of people turning a blind eye? Not everyone is so corrupt, but a majority are. To be honest, it isn't just the government which is corrupt, but also the people themselves. When people only vote for the representatives to get a job, aid, or money, that's when you know people are corrupt." End quote. Jim also told us that some of his own family members have been trying for 5 years to have their national IDs replaced, and were only helped when they promised to vote for a specific person. He would also mention that any aid into Lebanon from US or UN food packages would be worthless without proper distribution, as he had witnessed people steal the aid to be sold for profit. Something that we noticed, at least anecdotally, is that both Jim and Daniel seem to be moderate in their political views. Jim clearly condemned both sides for conflict, seeing Israel as a foreign power unnecessarily hitting civilian targets, and Hezbollah as a puppet of Iran which has brought nothing but misery to Lebanon. On the other hand, Sergeant Daniel has never given us the impression that he's a dispassionate soldier. Daniel has been a contact for the channel for over a year, and he's constantly made it very clear that he has very little love for Benjamin Netanyahu's government. From his perspective, Hezbollah has very obviously been ramping up for another October 7th style attack, so Israel's push into Lebanon is just an unfortunate act of self-defense. It's easy to think that these wars are relatively binary, but in our experience, these more moderate views are way more common than viewers might expect. There are millions of people caught up in a conflict they don't want any part in, seemingly held hostage by relatively small groups of extremists on either side. Even before the war, Lebanon's government was suffering very low approval metrics. Israel had seen some of the largest protests in the nation's history, and Hamas hasn't actually won an election since 2006. It may just be our anecdotal experience, but we suspect that most people in the region don't care about expanding their borders or wiping out their neighbors, and simply want to be left alone in peace. We can only hope they get this in their lifetime. That was supposed to be the end of the story, but just days before the end of the month, a ceasefire agreement was struck between Israel and Hezbollah, brokered by the United States and France. We'll likely cover the ceasefire in a lot more detail next month, but what we know for now is that the agreement mandates a 60-day halt to hostilities, while Israel withdraws from southern Lebanon. A 5-country monitoring panel will be put in place to ensure compliance, while 5,000 Lebanese troops have been deployed as enforcement. As part of the ceasefire, Israel retains the right to retaliate if attacked during this timeframe. We'll know more about how the ceasefire holds in next month's episode. It's been roughly a year since Javier Milei was elected to be the president of Argentina, and the question still remains whether or not the country has become better or worse under his radical anarcho-capitalist vision. Viewers might remember Javier Milei as the flamboyant Argentinian TV personality who was just as likely to talk shit to his rivals than debate his political stances. Others might remember him as the comparatively mild-mannered economics professor who had written as many as 50 economic papers by 2016. More still will likely remember him as his Malay's superhero alter ego, General ANCAP, who uses a chainsaw to cut regulations, the budget, and the bureaucratic red tape. He's been called the Wig, the Lion, the Crazy One, and a rock singer and tantric sex instructor. Despite being president, he previously called Al Capone a hero, and despite being a Catholic, he once called Pope Francis a filthy leftist. Malay has an irrational fear of birds, but his dog Conan has his own Wikipedia page. In 2018, he was the most interviewed economist on the planet, and in 2023, Time magazine named him as one of the top 100 most influential people in the world. Javier Malay might just be the most interesting person on Earth, so let's see if that means he can run a country. Since the start of Malay's presidency, Argentina's monthly inflation has slowed down to a record low of 2.7%, the lowest it's been in at least 3 years. This was one of the many promises Malay touted during his campaign, and he was able to pull it off within his first year. While Malay's shock therapy for Argentina's economy has gone a long way to start getting inflation under control, this didn't come without some serious reform. Some economists like to approach a problem with a scalpel, others with a sledgehammer, but they don't call Malay's approach chainsaw economics for nothing. Shortly after taking office, Malay slashed state subsidies for fuel, devalued the peso by 50%, and cut the number of government ministries in half. These 11 ministries were later merged into the remaining 11. As you might imagine, these cuts tend to leave a lot of Argentinians caught in the crossfire. Since coming into office, there has been a 38% cut on pensions for retirees, which has become particularly painful when the price of essential goods and medicine has risen sharply. Argentina's infrastructure spending has also remained frozen for the last year, with all projects cancelled, delayed, or under audit, as at least 200,000 workers have been laid off from the construction sector. Turning to education, and public universities are struggling to operate, as President Malay eliminated the National Fund for Teacher Incentives and drastically cut student scholarship programs. This isn't even mentioning the cuts to key science agencies around the country, which have had their research funding cut by around 30%. President Malay also closed the Telem News Agency, the largest state news agency in Latin America, while also drastically reducing the budget for Argentina's cinema and audiovisual arts departments. The same budget cuts have also been applied to hospitals, museums, women's shelters, and organizations designed to aid citizens experiencing poverty. Despite 66% of children under the age of 14 living under the poverty line within Argentina, Milei has also gone forward with slashing the budget allocating to children's aid and subsequent food benefit programs. On the topic of minors, Milei has also gone out of his way to officially ban the teaching of gender theory, while maintaining a stance that the government shouldn't be teaching sexual education as part of the curriculum. Moving on to the world stage, and Argentina was also the sole vote against a United Nations resolution denouncing women's violence. A representative for Malay's government would state that the draft resolution contained ambiguous terms such as hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation, which they argue could be used to restrict freedom of speech. This certainly isn't the first time Malay's government has been a lone dissenting voice on the world stage. Only this month, 168 out of 169 countries voted in favor of a UN draft resolution calling for the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. Seemingly wanting to be the muse for a Paramore song, Argentina was the only exception. In another strange move this month, Argentina's entire delegation to the COP29 climate conference was ordered to withdraw. Just like when Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon were tasked with negotiating a deal with the Trade Federation, the negotiations were short. We couldn't find a statement on why exactly the Argentinian representatives were called back. However, Milei has previously called the climate crisis a, quote, socialist lie. It's worth mentioning that Javier Milei wasn't just some radical candidate who won the election by a razor-thin margin, but rather, he won by the highest percentage of any president since 1973. Argentina had just experienced levels of inflation that were extreme even in the post-COVID world, meaning as crazy as it sounded, the cosplayer wielding a chainsaw was seen as the more sensible option. Despite this, much of the support came as a large protest vote, as the previous government's economic management had led the nation to such a dire position in the first place. Although protest votes tend to be great for winning an initial election, this doesn't stop unrest when poverty is still rampant and thousands of people lose their stable government jobs. We should also keep in mind that Javier Milei hasn't been able to take off his training weights and go all out on his initial grand plan. This is because his La Libertad Avanza coalition doesn't hold a majority in Argentina's Congress. Milei's vision still sees the country selling off over 24 state-owned companies, including the national water supplier, railways, postal service, and Argentina's national airline, Aerolíneas Argentinas. The president also has his sights set on both dollarizing Argentina's economy and abolishing the nation's central bank. However, these goals seem to have taken a backseat for the time being. Despite the dramatic government cuts, popularity for the president is still somewhere around the 50-50 mark. President Milei's supporters are confident that his budget cuts will allow Argentina to prosper in due time, while the president's detractors are more concerned over what his continued radical policy will do for the country going forward. Javier Milei's entire strategy more or less involves breaking down the foundations of Argentina's government to reshape them into a leaner and cheaper system. Earlier this year, the International Monetary Fund gave Argentina high marks in its assessment, stating that its performance was better than expected. These high marks don't appear to have translated into a better quality of life for the average Argentinian. But Milei still has another 3 years in office before we can really judge whether these drastic measures have worked out. It's now been over 1,000 days since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so let's check in on the little country that could. As a reminder, in August this year, Ukraine's military began its counteroffensive into the Russian region of Kursk, seizing over 1,376 square kilometers of territory, including the key town of Sudza. Using electronic warfare and US-supplied armored vehicles, they overwhelmed Russian defenses in the initial stage of the offensive. The surprise push caught Russian forces off guard, and experts believe that Ukraine's use of advanced technology, like electronic jamming, played a critical role in their early success. However, Russia was quick to respond, deploying 50,000 troops to the region to stop Ukraine from seizing any more territory. Although Ukraine's offensive forced Russia to weaken its other fronts, it did however take back a lot of its lost territory. And by early November, Ukraine's initial gains were reduced by more than 40%. Complicating matters further, over 10,000 North Korean troops reportedly joined Russian forces in the Kursk region. It's believed that much of these troops from North Korea have been pulled from the nation's Storm Battalion, a unit which specializes in infiltration, sabotage, and assassination. Although heavily indoctrinated and trained to withstand a high degree of physical and mental pain, nearly all of them are still yet to actually see any combat. With this in mind, these troops are still considered special forces, and although unfamiliar with Russian terrain, weapon systems, or language, they're still far better trained than Russia's own recruits. It's a bit like how B-2 super battle droids are far superior to the B-1 droids when we see them featured in 2002's Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones. On the domestic front, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Ukraine's parliament this month, introducing a 10-point resilience plan aimed at strengthening Ukraine's internal fortitude and ensuring sustained resistance against ongoing aggression. Let's briefly go over the 10 steps and what they mean. Step 1 is unity, emphasizing national cohesion. Zelensky highlighted the importance of solidarity among Ukrainians to withstand external pressures. As the old saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall. Second is frontline stability. The plan includes measures to stabilize the front lines and conduct necessary operations both in occupied Ukrainian territories and within Russia against military facilities. From the wording, it sounds like Ukraine has more offensives cooking. Step 3 is arms production. Recognizing the critical role of technology, the plan sets ambitious targets for domestic arms production, including at least 30,000 long-range drones and 3,000 cruise and missile drones in the coming year. Ukraine has long wanted to bolster its domestic production of weapons, as much of its current systems have been cobbled together by enterprising patriots. Step 4 is finances. While specific financial strategies were not detailed, the plan underscores the need for economic resilience to support ongoing defense efforts. You can't fight a war without money, and beg, borrow, or steal, Ukraine will need a mountain of cash to have any hope of maintaining its sovereignty. The fifth step is energy security. Acknowledging Russia's attempts to disrupt Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the plan focuses on protecting energy facilities, decentralizing electricity, and managing energy consumption. Russia has quite a history of attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, even going as far as targeting nuclear power plants. Considering the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened in what is now modern-day Ukraine, you'd think Russia would know not to fuck with nuclear power plants. Step 6 is security, probably a part that goes without saying in wartime, but the plan outlines comprehensive safety safety measures across all regions, aiming to create a secure environment for all citizens. 7 is community development. Strengthening local communities is identified as vital for national resilience. Those specific initiatives were not elaborated upon. Step 8 is human capital. Investing in the population's well-being and capabilities is highlighted as a cornerstone for enduring resilience. Ukraine, much like Russia, has found it increasingly harder to fill important positions, as the invasion has turned into a war of attrition. Step 9 is cultural sovereignty. Preserving and promoting Ukrainian cultural identity is emphasized as a means to bolster national unity and morale. Without a sense of cultural identity, there really isn't much to fight for. The last step emphasizes veterans. The plan includes provisions to support veterans, acknowledging their contributions and ensuring their reintegration into society. A whole country filled with traumatized, disenfranchised people who are thoroughly versed in combat is a recipe for disaster if not properly supported. Taking care of them now and after the war is going to be particularly important. This resilience plan serves as a domestic counterpart to the earlier victory plan presented to Western allies, focusing on internal strategies to fortify Ukraine's position amid the ongoing conflict. By addressing these multifaceted issues, President Zelensky aims to enhance Ukraine's capacity to endure and ultimately prevail in the face of sustained aggression. Moving away from Ukraine's borders, recent incidents have raised concerns about the security of undersea cables in the North Sea and surrounding regions. Notably, on the 15th of November, a Russian vessel claiming to be a research ship was detected near the UK coast, specifically around pipelines and internet cables between Dublin and Liverpool. The Royal Navy and RAF monitored the ship, which is believed to be capable of interfering with vital communication infrastructure using stealth submarines. Additionally, on November 18, 2 undersea cables in the Baltic Sea were damaged. One cable connected Finland to Germany, and the other linked Lithuania to Sweden. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius stated that the damage appeared to be a result of sabotage, though no concrete proof exists. These incidents underscore the vulnerability of undersea cables, which are crucial for global communications and data transmission. The exact causes of these disruptions are still under investigation, but the involvement of foreign vessels near critical infrastructure has heightened concerns about potential sabotage. Jumping back to Ukraine, and on the 20th of November, US and Western embassies were temporarily closed after receiving an imminent airstrike alert. The incident follows President Joe Biden's announcement the previous day, permitting Ukraine to use US-supplied ATACMS missiles on military targets within Russian territory. In response, Russia reportedly launched a retaliatory strike potentially involving RS-26 missiles. The RS-26 Rubezh is a ballistic missile whose classification oscillates between medium-range ballistic missile (IRBM) and intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM), depending on configurations and adopted definitions. Its estimated range falls between 2,000 to 6,000 kilometers and is capable of carrying 3 to 6 nuclear warheads. The United States confirmed that it had received a warning from Russia about the planned launch half an hour beforehand. Shortly following the US and UK's go-ahead to use their missiles to strike deeper into Russian territory, President Vladimir Putin stated that the war in Ukraine was escalating towards a global conflict. Putin said civilians would be warned ahead of further strikes. In addition to the RS-26 Rubezh, Russian forces launched a Kh-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic aeroballistic missile from an MiG-31K fighter jet, while 7 Kh-101 cruise missiles were fired by 2 95MS strategic bombers. We can only imagine this sentence would make sense to anyone who has more than 400 hours in Arma 3. Experts suggest this move is an attempt to pressure Western nations to cease their support for Ukraine by deploying nuclear-capable weapons for intimidation. A US official speaking anonymously stated that the use of this missile was likely symbolic, as it's closely associated with nuclear payloads, signaling Russia's intent rather than actual escalation. On the home front, recent surveys indicate a notable shift in Ukrainian public opinion regarding the ongoing conflict with Russia. For the first time since the war began, a majority of Ukrainians, 52%, now favor initiating negotiations to end the conflict promptly. This marks a significant change from February 2022, when 73% of Ukrainians supported continuing to fight until achieving a decisive victory. Of this 52% in support of negotiations, around half agree that Ukraine should be open to making some territorial concessions as a part of a peace deal to end the war. This evolving perspective reflects growing war fatigue and a desire among Ukrainians to explore diplomatic solutions to the prolonged conflict. Just to clarify, this still means that only around a quarter of Ukrainians surveyed would support territorial concessions. When asked who they would prefer to negotiate such a peace deal, the European Union seemed to be the clear favorite, with the United Kingdom following close behind. Third for their preferences saw the United States under a Kamala Harris presidency, then followed by the US under Donald Trump's stewardship, something we should probably talk about. On the campaign trail, President Trump stated that upon being elected, he would end both the Israel-Hamas war and the Russia-Ukraine war in a single day. Mr. Trump has never actually clarified how he might pull this off during his presidency, but it's assured that this would mean granting territorial concessions to Russia in exchange for a ceasefire. During the second presidential debate leading up to the election, Mr. Trump was directly asked whether he wanted Ukraine to win the war, to which he stated, quote, "I want the war to stop." US support for Ukraine remains largely popular according to recent polling. However, democratically aligned voters appear to be far more willing to back Ukraine indefinitely. With this in mind, the US itself has become one of the biggest winners of the war in Ukraine. Since the start of the war, the United States has managed to supercharge its defense industry, give away huge stockpiles of its outdated equipment, use Ukraine as a testing ground, and cripple one of its largest geopolitical allies. Not only this, but it's managed to do so with a small fraction of its US defense budget, all while not losing a single American soldier on the ground. US leadership during the Cold War would have given their right bolt and left nut for a deal that good. Earlier this year, CIA Director William Burns commented on the United States' support for Ukraine with, quote, "For the United States to walk away from the conflict at this crucial moment and cut off support to Ukraine would be an own goal of historic proportions." Experts have also warned that Russia gaining any amount of territory would set an incredibly dangerous precedent for a US-dominated world order. The United States has managed to maintain its superpowered status precisely because their word matters. When Uncle Sam says they have your back, it goes a long way to stop other expansionist nations from trying their luck. With this in mind, if Russia is able to keep Ukrainian territory after the war, it could hurt US credibility as a reliable ally. If a would-be invader knows that it has to just wait out the current American administration, it might just change how the whole game is played. Russian state media often paints American democracy as divided, inefficient, and inferior to its own de facto dictatorship, and winning a piece of Ukraine would certainly give this sentiment a lot of credibility. We'll be covering the Ukrainian invasion as long as it takes, so whatever happens, viewers are free to subscribe to see where the future leads. That sure was a crazy month, but you know what's even crazier? Not checking out our second channel, Sir Swag Academy. The standout edition this month was Krusty's presentation on the legendary USS Yorktown, the ship that just wouldn't die. We'd also like to thank our amazing Patreon supporters, who make this series and channel possible. As you might imagine, it's not easy to fund an entire news team when YouTube pays us a grand total of fuck all, so your support really does hard carry this entire operation. Viewers who just want to throw us a few bucks or just have your name in the end credits can do so with a link in the description. But until next time, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy December.